Having a good part of the community constantly call my job and roll brain dead, boring, useless, and claim I'm only brought for 1% really sucks. And seeing that same Reaper who gives me about those things then parsing green and doing more DPS than my purple just puts salt in the wounds. With patch 6.1 just around the corner and the machinist being quite literally the first job mentioned in the balance changes slide, I actually really want to talk about the state of physical range DPS in Final Fantasy XIV right now, which I won't beat around the bush, is actually fairly unhealthy. This is something that has really been up in the forefront of my mind as I've been reforming the last few slots of my static for DSR, especially because we had some leave due to work concerns, and thank God I'm down to the last slot as of last night, but I digress there. But the one thing that has become painfully obvious through this process is ranged physical DPS is the hardest DPS role to fill in my groups by far. Now that I've been exposed a lot to the larger PF sphere, not just a little, not just every so often, but very often I have been sitting in a full PF group, even with both tanks there, for over half an hour for a P2 chest, or I mean P1 or P2 two chest groups on a Wednesday or Thursday evening. So we're not talking like Sunday or like a Monday, and the item level requirement is literally at 580 requirement, which genuinely finding this out and experiencing it myself shocked me, because if I wasn't a healer, I actually really do enjoy ranged physical, which apparently makes me very much in the minority of players. While all of this can be taken with a grain of salt as it is anecdotal, when I reached out to friends in various parts of the community, they really resonated with what I had said and like was asking, and the message was so loud and so clear that, well, I decided to make a video on it. Talking to people, it broke down into three major problems. First of all is the ranged physical DPS tax. Secondly is going to be community perception, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot more than just that to that point. Community perception was very big. But thirdly is a lot of people don't enjoy the kits for various reasons, such as they have to give up their own personal DPS that they could have and be in control of, and that they need to also reposition themselves to open up mechanics for melee or casters, and fundamentally they feel more like the submissive or the bottom rolled, so to speak, which to say the least rubs salt in the wound for many. So let's start with the first point, which is the ranged physical DPS tax. Should that even be something relevant today? This is something that a lot of people have been asking, especially a lot lately. They're just like, okay, not many mechanics actually impact a melee DPS to justify why a melee DPS is doing so much more DPS than a physical range. Then on the other hand, people are just like, okay, but they need to manage positionals and all this. What I've noticed through a lot of the arguments, just trying to be as fair to both sides as possible, is that there's this push about like people being like, okay, but if there are a mechanic that requires us to go out, then we need to think about how we get in, even though there are a host of tools at their disposal. And then to the other side, it's just like, but there aren't really that many mechanics to do that. Even if there are mechanics that do that, we often will, as a community, especially on Aether, push for uptime strategies. Actually, saying Aether might not be the best example, because we were doing lights rampant with that one strategy, and then we were doing happy brambles. Yeah, maybe that was the best example. But us as a larger community will gravitate generally to melee uptime strategies. At least this is one thing that we are doing a lot on North American servers. Fundamentally, the idea is that if you are a ranged physical DPS, you should be doing less damage than a melee DPS or anything with a cast time. This is actually something that is clear as day if you pull up FF logs on pretty much any fight. This expansion is as clear as day. Absolutely, Machinist is down in the depths of despair, like just off in Narnia, and then Bard and Dancer aren't that deep, but they are pretty close to like that deep. They are literally the second and third lowest. Now the question that should be asked is, should it be that low? Should ranged physical DPS, just by default, by being ranged physical DPS, have this low of DPS? Especially when we look at the changes that the Machinist is getting in 6.1, the slide says that its potency increases to multiple actions including Drill, Heat Blast, and Wildfire. Raw damage is really the focus of the Machinist here. Machinist really offers no unique utility of its own, unlike the Dancer that has its barrier and heal abilities, and the Bard jobs that can amplify a Scholar's Atla for deployment tactics. As playing Scholar as my main for like all these years, that's what I think about that ability as, but they also bring in Asuna, which is actually very relevant. We've seen its usage in T, we've seen it in E8S. Point is, these other jobs, on top of having more DPS than the Machinist, also bring their extra forms of utility. Oh yeah, and mobility. It means essentially all that the Machinist in particular has its damage. And then when you look at the Reaper, which has unique mobility abilities as well as Arcane Crest to contribute party-wide AoE healing on virtually every single AoE because it has a 30-second cooldown and it does top damage, it's really rubbing salt in the wound. Now we need to add in factors like your damage output is necessary to beat enrage timers, and with tighter enrage timers for Savage and Party Finder groups, peace and love, y'all know that's true, it's not a surprise that range physical probably is the most frustrated DPS job to take into the PF, with so much less agency over their damage. Either your total DPS, your total contributions to damage, is really low as a machinist, or completely dependent on your teammates as dancer or bard, with wildly swinging buff damage contributions depending on how your teammates perform. It's not really a comfortable spot to willingly put yourself in. Building on top of that, ultimately this has implications on why are we taking a ranged physical DPS into our group for a particular piece of content, which people have unironically been theory crafting and checking into if they would be better off dropping the 1% extra bonus from taking a physical ranged DPS for replacing them with a black mage. Depending on who you talk to, some people say, oh, that's total malarkey, but then there's other people who are just like, okay, but I know a really good black mage and I don't necessarily know a really good physical range DPS, and I'm pretty sure with this guy that I can trust it might be worth it. There's definitely some interesting clamor and talking going on, especially with DSR on the horizon. I'm thinking if you do not need that 1% in order to survive, you might see some groups completely drop range physical if they aren't significantly buffed in terms of numbers in 6.1. I myself am going with the more standard comp, if anyone's wondering, but I am hearing it all the time now. Maybe I shouldn't say all the time, but there's definitely talk about it. Now let's get to the second point, which is community perception, and to tiptoe the rabbit hole rather than dive down into it, because that'll take literally hours to go through. A significant portion of the player base views ranged DPS with almost a sort of bitter disdain that they aren't in melee range, they don't have the positionals, they don't have the extremely large cast times like Black Mage, although one could actually counter that in saying that the current expansion Black Mages have all the tools and more than they ever had in order to manage excellent uptime given enough familiarity with the fight, such as 2 charges of triple cast is pretty stellar. That really we have seen this different skill ceiling about as a ranged physical DPS, okay, give us some different options for this, but I digress here. This perception though has skewed the community where if you play a ranged physical DPS in spite of player skill or effort, because you might be really good, people are basically saying no matter what that you aren't skilled, that you're playing something that is trivial or easy, or that you are simple to replace. Rewind to the start of this video where I said ranged physical DPS is brutally difficult to fill in PF, to say the least. At the end of the day, you want to log onto a game and enjoy it and feel good about playing it and yourself. After all, we're all here by choice, for fun, and seeing people dump on what you enjoy isn't really fun, also by proxy on you, and so-called bring your skill and intelligence into question, that isn't a good feeling. To the third and final point, which is people aren't enjoying aspects of the ranged physical DPS kits, which is broken into 2 parts that I can personally speak on my own experience from. First up is people just don't enjoy the rotations or find them less interesting to their particular play style. For me personally, this is something that actually impacted me directly with this expansion's dancer changes, where Dancer's ability Flourish used to provide the dancer with the charges of all of their 4 upgraded abilities. That meant the 2 melee ones too. So optimal gameplay involved using those melee. And so this led to me actually needing to get into melee range every so often, not all the time, but every so often, and weave in and out and really leveraging that mobility aspect. And that was something that in retrospect, now I realize I really actually enjoyed, because Dancer with that change became, for me personally, so much less enjoyable for me. So that sort of thing for various aspects of the kit is here. But another one that I heard commonly was Machinist Wildfire just isn't spectacular enough. And yes, that is one ability that is being buffed here, but in its current state speaking now, it is currently roughly 900-ish potency for a so-called big 2-minute cooldown, which is actually 900 these days is actually pretty unremarkable numbers. But further from that, not a lot of people actually enjoy being bottoms on the abacus, because the abacus for the dancer or bard will usually show your numbers hovering around the tanks, and that just doesn't really feel great to see. Even though the abacus isn't telling the full truth and your DPS is essentially given away from you to your team, is this mental game of, wow, why am I so low on the abacus? To mention, a huge part of the ranged physical DPS role is resolving mechanics in such a way that you open up time and space for your team to do their own optimal rotations with as little downtime to them as possible. Essentially, if you're just a bard or dancer, you're kind of, in some people's perception, being a little subby for your team, and that obviously rubs people a lot of people in the worst way possible. Especially when you combine that with the community perception at this point, it is like throwing gas on the fire, because now you're supporting the team and raising their damage through your abilities and mechanical gameplay, and you are still being told that you're not skilled, being carried, and the rest, and that you are inferior to like the melee DPS in your group, which really is unhealthy. I don't know how else to say it, but this is unhealthy. To anyone that hears that, that's just like, that's my group, run. That's so unhealthy. Which really leads us to the end of the video. Like, right now, ranged physical DPS aren't in the best of spots, and it's for those really big 3 points that we're not in what I'd call a really healthy spot for the role. This is why we're seeing it reflected in harder time filling those slots, to say the least. To do a recap, first of all is the ranged physical DPS tax, just lower damage output. Secondly is going to be the community perception, and thirdly is a lot of people just don't enjoy the kits for various reasons, such as they give up their own DPS and they need to reposition themselves to open up mechanics for those other party members and fundamentally feel more like a subby or bottomy role, so to speak. Now that does it for this video. Take care everyone and have a fantastic day. Let me know in the comments what you think.